So we rented a house there in Winfield. One of the regular boarders went along, for we had 3 bedrooms and plenty of furniture. They didn't want it, and there was no sale for the very old-type dressers and beds. No springs, just slots across the hold, the feather beds used in those days. This man paid $5 a week, and it really fed us all. So all we had to raise was $16 a month. We lived here only for 3 months. William decided to go down near Newkirk and get his stock and wagon. He had 2 mules, Sadie and Pay. They had been out in a pasture. They were held over from his deal in buying for his dad, and there seemed to be no sale for them, so they fell to William. He learned of some great work down in the southern part of the state of Oklahoma. He went down and got some excavating things. Some his dad had taken in on debts and some picked up at auctions, when his dad had cried sales around the country. So we took our furniture down to Newkirk, and I went to live with an old lady who was a retired school teacher, still in Winfield. She had only 2 rooms, but was kind to me. I thought I would ail. I was so sorry for William to leave, but he got a tent and a stove, so again boxes for chairs, and he took a pair of springs, though not like we have today. These were simply straight wire crisscrossed, no give to them at all. It was just a week or so before Christmas. I left to go. Oh, how glad I was to go to William. He was located out from a small town a few miles of Oklahoma City. He had 3 men working for him, and he was boarding them, and by doing so, he could get them cheaper. He also had a partner, so there were 4 without William. There were no conveniences, a small cook stove, and a long homemade table. The stove was old and smoked. I tried to take over the cooking, but I was expecting my baby in April, and the job was too much, and I had took down for 2 weeks, bad cold and mere exhaustion. When I was up and around, he had a girl to go ahead, and I helped her all I could. Dear old mother, though not old then, worried about me. Wrote and told me to stay away from the cook tent and get some things ready for our baby. She sent me some materials and made by hand 3 nightgowns and 10 diapers, some little shirts, and I folded them and put them in our box dresser. Every night I would get them out and look at them. William was happy. About now, the murder case of Harry K. Thaw and Stanford White in New York was filling the papers. It all had happened some time earlier, but now this trial was in progress. We got a weekly newspaper, and it would be full. I would sit hours reading the whole paper to William. I read every evening to him in the years of our early married life. He enjoyed it, and I loved doing it too. The contract he had out in camp was finished. He had to replace or buy some implements to keep his crew working, and he got out with very little cash on hand. My time was so near, he didn't want to take another job. I had wanted to wait until it was over to let my dear mother know, for I knew she would worry. Then, too, I had a desire to surprise Sister Bessie, as she had a boy almost a year old, born a few weeks before the earthquake. They all thought I would never have any children.
About the 1st of March, Mother Lane sent word for William to bring me to her. I was so glad, so he left the stock in the care of one of his men, and we drove up in a wagon. But when we got there, we found dear Mother was also soon to have a baby. But she was so happy to have us. We engaged our doctor, and I went ahead and made a few more extra things. We had been there only a few days when William had an accident. He was driving 2 high-spirited mules, and they ran away and broke his leg at the ankle. Now he was laid up. The doctor told us to keep his leg in hot salts 3 times a day at 1 hour at a time. He wanted us to sit and rub it, so I did. Spent hours with it the next month. About the end of the 1st week of April, he started on crutches. Our mother was wonderful, did all she could, and her looking for her baby in a month or 2. I took sick on Friday night, and our Gertha was not born till Sunday at 5 p.m. William was so happy. If he wanted a son, he didn't show it. This April 8th, 1907, was a big day in our life, and Mother was proud of her first grandchild. Well, it was a joy to write and tell the folks we too had a red-headed baby. William's leg was healing, but he was still on crutches. In 2 weeks, I was able to be up and doing things for myself and baby. All of a sudden, William took a notion to go back, and he said he wouldn't go without baby and I, but I was in no shape to go, as there was no place to move into yet. So Mother tried to get him to let me stay a few more weeks until he had a place for us. But he insisted, and we left on the train. How sad I was to leave poor Mother. Of course, Alice was 19 and could do the work, but Mother and I had been so close together, and I wanted to be there for her baby's birth. Money was all gone, so it was hard to find a place to move into, but in a day or so we got 2 rooms, a small boxcar-shaped house, but it was a palace to us. William left the stock on grass implements stored on empty lot and started to shoe horses. It was ready money. Well, they were happy days. William would say, "I could hardly wait to get home." This was the secret of our happiness. But I didn't gain. My resistance was low. I nursed our baby. I had loads of milk, but it took my strength. I kept running down. The water situation was awful, insufficient to go around. We bought 1 barrel a day. We did not know it, but what we did have was polluted, and people all over this town of Frederick were getting down with slow fever. When the baby was 3 months old, I came down, and the doctor said it was the dreaded disease. They immediately took the baby off breast milk right away. Here came dear Mother. She left her baby and came. Poor William. He went through torture. I got worse. They called in another doctor for consultation. My second week I went out of my head completely, talked at random. We had wanted to call our baby's name in honor of our mother's William. Said not Rose. He said take Etta's real mother's name was Rosetta and mine was Florabelle. So we hastily started to call her Ettabelle. But before I took ill, I wasn't satisfied, for all around us were people who had moved in from Texas and other southern locations, and so many of their children were called by double names, and throughout the day I got so disgusted hearing them scream for their children, from Ida May to all sorts of double names. So during the 11 days when I was so ill, I started to call our baby Gertha. We had never heard the name but once. A lovely lady we knew while we were at a restaurant was a Gertha Blondell, and I really loved her, so it never changed.
The fever continued to rage. The baby's formula didn't agree with her, so they had her sick too. William walked the floor. He was so sure they couldn't pull me through. Mother nursed me and took care of baby in the daytime. Of course, I wasn't much care, except 3 times a day, a cool rub to run down the fever. I didn't move around much in the bed. I was too weak. So when I had lingered 8 weeks, the doctor told William tonight is the crisis. Long toward the next morning, early morning, my fever went down. Then they had to be so careful it didn't drop too low. The 2 doctors were anxious to pull me through, and it proved to be a wonderful feather in their cap, as by now my case had been the worst prolonged one. They usually died when they got as low as I did. When I was so I could talk, Mother went home. She didn't want us to stay down there and tried to get William to come back to Newkirk, but he didn't much want to put back with his father, as he was too much under his jurisdiction and he wanted to be on his own. Our baby was slow to gain. She was not up to normal in weight, was pale and had diarrhea. She was 2 years old before she started to gain. She was no care, just as good as any baby could be. We were both getting better, and it was much because I was taking her out every day in the sunshine. I got a little buggy, or a go-kart it was called, and she loved it. William had sold a gentle mare he had given me, the one I have already spoken of here. I had named her Martha Jet, and I drove her to a top buggy. We still had the buggy. One day William said I could drive a new horse we had just bought. I was good with the handling of the horse, so I guess he didn't realize I had a baby. So one afternoon I went out for a drive. The top was rolled back. Gertha was happy to go, but we hardly got to the edge of town when the horse started to run. He seemed to fly, so he ran so fast. I knew he would turn us over if I tried to hold Gertha and the reins too, so I took her by the arm and lifted her over the wheel and dropped her to the ground. In about 50 yards, the horse ran me into a low culvert and threw me out, but my dress caught and he dragged me several feet before I got loose. I had 3 ribs fractured and was bleeding over my chest where the flesh was scratched. Gertha was only bruised. By now, William was running a dray delivering anything he could get orders for. The money was hard to get, and so many owed him for his work. So finally things got worse, and I took Gertha up to Newkirk for a few weeks, and while there, the folks wrote that and said that they would send an RR ticket if I would come home so they could see our little girl. But she was really enjoying life with Lucille and the little pony Flaxie, which her father had when he was her age. We went home and got ready. I had intended to go back in a few months, but William had our household things stored. A fire later destroyed them. Times were hard. When we arrived, my dear mother was so glad to see her granddaughter. She was 3.5 years old. Bessie had 3. Flora and Charlie were added to their family. They lived a couple of blocks away. Flossie and Charlotte both worked in a factory. Margaret and Billy were in school, as was Opal, who was now 10 years old. I went to work in a laundry as William had no money. He was doing well to eat regular. In 1911, Rolly took over a meat market. He had been working for another man and had learned to cut meat. So I went in to work for him as bookkeeper and cashier. He couldn't pay me in money, but he furnished the family with butter, lard, and what he carried in the shop. He also stayed with us at home.
I didn't hear from William often, once in a while at postal. I didn't get homesick anymore, but I often wondered how our things were he had stored back in Wichita Falls, Texas, located just over the Lula Line. A friend of ours wrote me late in 1911 that William seemed so very lonesome and unhappy. She said she felt sorry for him. Raleigh was so kind and good to me. I didn't have much money, but Gertha and I had a home and plenty to eat. By this time I was getting my mind made up for William to stay back there permanently, as he could go ahead with his desires with stock, and we were not a drawback to him. All he needed to do was take care of himself. So, all through the winter of 1911, I did the bookkeeping for Bro Raleigh at his shop, and we continued to stay with the folks. I settled down to a contented situation. Gertha was a perfect little lady, never gave any others a moment's worry. She and I didn't get out much except when Raleigh took us. Charlotte and Flossie would go to a dance or 5-cent show on Saturday nights. Margaret was graduating from high school that year. My precious father was so sweet to me. His love and kindness is so deeply buried in the depths of my heart. I often have the joy of thinking back to those days. Until I got a job, he would so often slip some money in my hand. He and I were always the first ones up in the morning, and I got so much joy being with him, as he seemed to understand me. I hardly ever got homesick now, as I was more convinced William would get back to his life before we were married and would have some time to find a happy life. I got a postal card from him, and he was in L.A. He said he was very homesick for us. I wrote and told him we were fine and not to worry about us. Well, next time was weeks later. He had worked his way to Tucson, Arizona, and was a cook in a camp of some sort, and he had said he was anxious to come and see us. I didn't hear from him again until early March 1912. He walked in on us, and oh, he was glad to get there. We left the 1st of April for Tucson, and he worked 1 month and wanted to come back to California. We lived near some Spanish people. Oh, they were nice to us. They all spoke so soft and were kind. The town was made up of so many who had come there for health, and often they got well and never wanted to leave. We came home on a train and got 1 room in SF for a month and returned to South San Francisco. William went to work for Kaufman Brothers, who had a drayage business. Hours were long, and his wages were $75 a month. I went back to helping Raleigh, and we lived in 2 of the rooms in the rear of the shop. We had very little in the way of furnishings for a house, as all of our belongings were stored back in Wichita Falls, Texas, where William had put them when we broke up housekeeping, as I previously spoke of here. About this time, Mother and Father brought up a home in a more select locality, an old house they planned on remodeling. We moved into a house which was already furnished, had 2 rooms. The front one on the lower floor was rented to a man who operated a saloon. Their home was in Oakland, and his wife would come up over weekends. This was a bad setup, as they had to pass through our kitchen to get to the bathroom.
We moved in about Christmas of 1912. The folks meantime got into their house. In July of this year, Charlotte had been married to an ex-soldier who was an Irish fellow born in New York, but whose parents came from Ireland. They were living in South San Francisco. He was a pipe fitter and worked at one of the factories. Spring came, and Mother was much concerned about me as I was pregnant, so she wanted us to come to live up there. But this house was being torn up for adding rooms. Also, they were putting the second story on. So William looked around and found a 2-room building for sale. He moved it on the rear of their lot, and he got it fixed up, and we moved into it right away. The rooms were large. By now, Charlotte was expecting a baby, and she came to stay with us for a while, but Mother would take her up with her later. Raleigh was engaged to a dear girl named May King, who lived in San Francisco. They got married in the fall of 1913, and of course went right into the meat market and took over all the finances, and they moved into a house that Raleigh bought on Grand Avenue. Margaret was keeping company with a young man, Frank Turner, and they were married late this same year. Charlotte's time was about up, and she went into Mother's house until her boy arrived, and he was named Edward Fitzgibbons. His father's name was Joseph Patrick, nicknamed Fitz in the Army. Eddie was born May 22, 1913. Margaret and Frank got a house downtown on Loudoun Avenue. Bessie and Harry moved down on Commercial Avenue, and they had gone up to a lumber mill in Hobart Hills in 1911, where Harry worked, and had now sometime late in 1914 or spring of 15 back in South San Francisco again. August 14th of the year 1913, our second daughter was born, and we called her Audrey Lucille for 2 of William's sisters. When she was a few months old, I went to work in a restaurant and worked several months. We got together $100 for a down payment on a house and found one on Baden Avenue. We both did a lot of work on it and finally moved in late in the same year of 1915. William was driving a Ford truck for the Western Meat Company, and while cranking it, broke his arm at the wrist, so was out of work quite a spell, no compensation as yet. When he was able to work, he got other work, made 2.5 a day, went to work at a pipe and steel, it was called, and had Charlotte's husband for a partner. He had worked along with him before, and he was a fine mechanic. We loved our home on Baden Avenue, paying $20 a month, but it was ours, and we had nice neighbors. We were only half block from school, and Gertha could go down the hill, and it only took a few minutes. She was 8 years old now. We were only 3 blocks from the folks, and I was up there every day. Margaret and Frank had a boy, Gerald, by now, and Bessie had a new son, Harry Jr. San Francisco had a World's Fair in 1915, and oh, it was a grand affair.
In 1916, Alice and Wes located here and were living down near Charlotte and 2 blocks from Margaret. Now we were all living in southern San Francisco. Billy and Opal were still at home, Flossie was working in the lab at Fuller's, and Opal was there too, but in rubber paint. Brother Bill was at the steel mill. We bought our first automobile, a 1915 Special Studebaker. We were really proud of it. Audrey was such a pretty child. Gertha, who was lovely too, with her beautiful red hair. She was a quiet, reserved girl, and oh, such a help to me, always there when I needed her. And in those days I was in a horrible physical and even nervous mental condition, easy to fly up, on account of the earlier trouble after Audrey's birth. Having had a bad time with an unskilled physician, I was worse. When she was 5 months old, I went to the San Francisco County Hospital for 7 weeks, and during the time had a capital operation, or major as they're called these days. Having no money, I went to the San Francisco Hospital. I got wonderful care, and came home in perfect condition as far as the operation was concerned, but very nervous. I was so very lonesome for my 2 girls, too, while away, but Charlotte was so good she brought the baby out as often as she could. Of course, she had to come on a streetcar, and it took so long to get out there. William was so wonderful, too.
This is Carol Shehorn McReynolds, and these are some of my memories of Grandma Lane. First, I just want to say it has been just so much fun for me to do this video of Grandma, and has brought back so many memories. And it's been especially great to have all the granddaughters participate. So thank you so much. My first memories of Grandma Lane are going to her house and spending the night. And I was always sort of a homesick kind of girl, never liked to stray too far from home. So I did get homesick, and Mom had to come and get me early. But Grandma did so much to make me feel comfortable. She would take us me downtown into the city, and we'd walk down a steep hill. And of course, she always had on a dress and her cute little granny shoes that she always wore, and a hat, of course, and gloves. And I remember going into, I think it was Macy's, and just thinking it was such a grand store. I do remember one time, I think she was trying to bribe me to stay because we got a 50-cent bag of M&Ms that she gave me. It was one of those big giant bags. So that was a memory. But the biggest memory that I have is sitting in the living room on the floor and going through her photo album. Every time I went there, that was the first thing I always wanted to do. And she'd tell me all the names of the family and, all these incredible names that were, like Flossie and Charlotte and Opal, and just names of her time. And I just enjoyed so much going through that photo album. My very first photo album that I got was from Grandma, and this is a picture of it. And that was so special for me to start my own photo album. And some of the other things about Grandma, she was neat and tidy. I remember her house. And when we would come, she would buy the kind of cereal that I liked, Sugar Pops, of course. I'm sure she never ate that kind of stuff on her own. And I just loved her house. I loved the little service porch. Just everything about it was so cute. One time, or when she got a little older, I think this was actually the last time we saw our mom, was in 1968. And we had gone over to her house, and she always talked about her arthritis in her hip. We'd say, how are you, Grandma? And she'd go, oh, my pain starts in my left hip. Of course, now that's come back to haunt me, because we used to kind of laugh about it. And now I think I've inherited that arthritic pain in my left hip. So, but that's okay. And her eyesight was going. I remember she gave us a piece of strawberry pie, and I guess our taste buds weren't very developed, but we didn't really care for it that much. And we thought, well, Grandma can't really see that we're not eating it. But so Linda and I kind of gave each other the eye, like, oh, and Grandma looked over and she goes, oh, you're not eating your pie. Well, she has pretty good eyesight now, I guess. And one last thing was so funny. I used to be in the 4-H. Linda and I were both in the 4-H, and we sewed our dresses. And I made this blue dress, I don't remember, 5th grade, I think. And there was a dress review where you'd go to a regional place, I don't remember where it was, and do a little dress review of the clothes that you made. And I guess the local TV station or PBS or something was covering it. And Grandma Lane was sitting at home watching, ironically, that same show, and she heard my name being called out. And she called Mom, and she couldn't believe, is that Carol, on TV? And so she'd always, until the last years of her life, anytime I saw her, she'd always say, oh, yes, I remember seeing you on TV. So that was my one claim to fame with Grandma. She was just the sweetest lady. And I'll always think of her fondly with love and affection.
Hi, this is Linda. I'm just going to tell a couple of things that I remember about Grandma Lane. As a child, I had the privilege, I should say, of going and staying with her on several occasions at her home in Brisbane. It was the sweetest little house. I loved going to her house, and it was as neat as a pin. She kept everything so tidy and clean, and she would walk around and tell me about the things in her house and where they came from, and about her family, and I just enjoyed being with her so much. And I remember on one occasion I took my roller skates with me because I could roller skate around the block, and on my trip around the block I found a nickel, and as a little kid I knew that nickel would buy me a candy bar, and I was so excited to find that nickel. And I went back and I told Grandma that I had found that nickel, and I wanted to go to the little store and go buy a candy bar, and she told me, just save it, don't always be in such a hurry to spend your money. And she told me to put it in my pocket and save it. So I put it in my pocket, and then I just kept asking her, well, can I go now and buy a candy bar? And she said, Linda, that nickel is burning a hole in your pocket. I had never heard that expression before, and I turned around because I had it in my back pocket to check to see if my pocket was on fire. And she laughed at me, and I said, what do you mean that nickel's burning a hole in my pocket? And she said, well, you just need to save it. Don't be in such a hurry to spend it. And I'll never forget that. I've never forget that. Every time I find a nickel, I think of Grandma Lane and her telling me that that nickel was burning a hole in my pocket. She always told me never leave hair in your hairbrush, and she would make sure that after I brushed my hair that I would clean out my hairbrush. She had an old Chesterfield that, gosh, I wish I could see one of those now. It was just an incredible old couch. And we used to sit on there, and she'd tell me stories and tell me stuff about her life and just all the important things. And she was just a faithful, devoted person to her family. And she never drove, and she never wore pants. And in my opinion, and even as I look at her pictures, she seemed to never change. She was always the same. I loved her so much, and I missed her so much when she passed, and got to have her till I was 19 years old, and that was a blessing to have a great grandparent that long. I love you, Grandma Lane.